John Michael Osbourne, the man the world knew as Ozzy Osbourne, stood at the edge of the private airstrip in Los Angeles, the California sun glinting off the wings of the small chartered jet that would carry him across the Atlantic and back to the place where everything had begun. He had not announced the trip to anyone, not to his manager, not to his family, not even to Sharon, who was busy with television commitments and would only learn of his absence when she noticed the empty side of the bed. Ozzy wore a simple black hoodie pulled low over his eyes, dark jeans, and scuffed boots that had seen more stages than most people had seen countries. In his hand was a battered acoustic guitar case, the kind he had carried as a teenager before the amplifiers grew to the size of refrigerators and the crowds swelled to the size of cities. The crew on the tarmac recognized him but kept their distance. Years of fame had taught them that the Prince of Darkness preferred silence when he was traveling light. As the jet climbed into the sky, Ozzy stared out the window at the sprawling grid of lights below the endless freeways and palm trees that had become his adopted home, and felt a pull in his chest that was older than any riff he had ever written. Birmingham was calling him not the Birmingham of sold-out arenas and screaming fans, but the Birmingham of cracked pavements, coal dust, and the smell of fried onions drifting from chip shops on Aston's High Street. He closed his eyes and let the engines hum, lull him into memories he had spent decades trying to outrun. The flight was long, the kind of long that made joints ache and thoughts circle like vultures. Ozzy refused the offered champagne and instead sipped black coffee from a paper cup, watching clouds drift over the ocean like ghosts of forgotten songs. He thought about the boy he had been, John Osbourne, dyslexic, left-handed, mocked at school, working the factory line at 14 because his father said dreams were for people who could afford them. He thought about the first time he had heard a Beatles record and felt something crack open inside him, a realization that music could be escape, could be power, could be a way out of the cage of poverty. He thought about the night he had formed a band in a pub basement with 3 other misfits, Tony, Geezer, Bill, and how they had named themselves Black Sabbath after a Boris Karloff film because it sounded ominous and because none of them believed in anything anymore. He thought about the drugs, the bats, the doves, the headlines, the rehabs, the children, the reality show, the knighthood that never came, but the OBE that did. And through all of it, the one constant had been the voice in his head that sounded like his mother's telling him never to forget where he came from, that the streets of Aston had forged him in fire and coal dust, and that fire never truly went out. When the plane touched down at Birmingham Airport, the sky was the color of wet slate, the air thick with the promise of rain. Ozzy pulled the hood lower and walked through the terminal without stopping at baggage claim. The guitar was all he had brought. Outside, he ignored the line of taxis and instead found a nondescript rental car agency where no one looked twice at the man in the hoodie signing for a modest Ford Focus. The clerk handed him the keys and a map, though Ozzy didn't need it. He knew these roads the way a sailor knows the sea. He drove north through the city, past the Bullring shopping center that had replaced the old markets, past the glass towers that had sprouted like weeds over the graves of factories. The radio played some modern pop song he didn't recognize, and he switched it off, preferring the sound of tires on wet asphalt and the occasional horn from impatient drivers. As he crossed the border into Aston, the landscape shifted. The buildings grew lower, the brick darker, the graffiti more honest. Corner shops with hand-painted signs advertised cigarettes and lottery tickets. Children kicked footballs against walls that had stood since before Ozzy was born. The smell hit him, first damp earth-frying oil, and beneath it all, the faint metallic tang of industry that never quite washed away. He parked the car on a side street near Whitten Lakes, a place where he and his mates used to skip stones and smoke stolen cigarettes. The lakes were smaller than he remembered, hemmed in by new housing estates, but the ducks still paddled in lazy circles, and the willows still drooped like weary old men. Ozzy sat on a bench and watched an elderly couple feed the birds, their movements slow and deliberate the way his parents had moved in their final years. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Regret, maybe, or the weight of time. He had sent money home, of course, had bought his mother a house in a nicer part of town, had paid for holidays and medical bills, but he had rarely stayed long enough to sit on a bench and feed ducks. Fame had given him everything and nothing. It had built walls higher than any factory chimney, and now, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he wanted to tear them down. That evening, he checked into a small bed and breakfast on the edge of Aston, the kind of place that advertised color TV in every room and served tea in chipped mugs. The landlady, a woman named Mrs. Patel, recognized him, but said nothing, simply handed him a key attached to a plastic fob shaped like a teapot. His room was on the second floor, overlooking a backyard, where laundry fluttered on a line like surrender flags. He set the guitar case on the bed and opened the window, letting in the sound of distant traffic and the laughter of children playing in the street. Sleep did not come easily. He lay in the dark, listening to the house settle, the creak of floorboards, the murmur of a television downstairs. At some point, he must have drifted off, because he dreamed of his father. Jack Osbourne stood at the mouth of a coal mine, his face blackened with dust, his eyes bright with something between fear and determination. Behind him, the tunnel stretched into darkness, and from somewhere deep inside came the sound of dripping water and the low rumble of machinery. Jack reached out a hand, but before Ozzy could take it, the dream shifted. He was a child again, standing in the kitchen of their terraced house, watching his mother stir a pot of stew, while his father cleaned coal dust from under his fingernails with a pocket knife. The radio played "She Loves You" by the Beatles, and his father hummed along off-key, a rare moment of lightness in a house where money was always tight and tempers shorter still. He woke before dawn, the dream clinging to him like smoke. The room was cold, the radiator clanking ineffectually. Ozzy dressed quickly and went downstairs where Mrs. Patel was already in the kitchen, the smell of bacon and toast filling the air. She poured him a cup of tea without asking and slid a plate across the table. "You're up early," she said, her voice gentle. "Going somewhere special?" Ozzy shrugged, unsure how to explain the restlessness that had driven him from Los Angeles to this quiet street in Aston. "Just visiting," he said. She nodded, as if she understood, and maybe she did. People in places like this had seen all kinds of wanderers, men running from something, men running to something, men who didn't know the difference. After breakfast, he walked. The streets were waking up, shop shutters rattling open, delivery vans, idling school children in uniforms trudging toward buses. He passed the pub, where he had played his first gig, the sign now reading "The Crown" instead of "The Opposition." The walls repainted, but the ghosts of cigarette smoke and spilled beer still lingering in his imagination. He passed the factory where he had tested car horns for 6 shillings an hour, the building now converted into luxury flats, with balconies that overlooked the same railway tracks where he used to watch trains disappear toward London and dream of escape. He passed the church where he had been baptized, the stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. Everywhere he looked, the past and present collided, new cars parked where horse carts once stood, satellite dishes sprouting from chimneys that had once belched coal smoke. But beneath the changes, the rhythm of the place was unchanged, the cadence of brummy accents, the smell of rain on pavement, the way neighbors nodded at strangers with a wariness that melted into warmth once you proved you belonged. Near midday, he found himself outside a small park where a group of old men played dominoes on a picnic table. One of them looked up and did a double-take. "Bloody hell," the man said, his voice rough with cigarettes and surprise. "Ozzy Osbourne, as I live and breathe." The others turned, and for a moment Ozzy braced himself for the usual frenzy: autographs, selfies, questions about bats, and reality TV. But these were Aston men, and Aston men didn't fuss. They simply pulled out a chair and poured him a cup of tea from a thermos. The man who had recognized him introduced himself as Tommy, said he used to drive a taxi and had once picked Ozzy up from the airport after a particularly chaotic tour. "You were off your head," Tommy said, grinning. "Kept calling me mate and trying to pay with a guitar pick." Ozzy laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. They talked about the old days, about bands that never made it, about the factory closures that had gutted the neighborhood, about the kids who left and never came back. Tommy mentioned the local nursing home St. Mary's, a place on the edge of town that had once been a convent and was now home to dozens of elderly residents, many of them former miners and factory workers. "They're shutting it down," Tommy said, slamming a domino on the table for emphasis. "Not enough money. The old folks have nowhere to go. My aunt's in there. Plays your records every Sunday." Ozzy felt the pull again, stronger this time. He had performed for kings and presidents, had filled stadiums with tens of thousands of screaming fans, but the idea of singing for a room full of old men and women who remembered the world before he was famous, it stirred something deep inside him. He asked Tommy for directions, and Tommy drew a rough map on the back of a cigarette packet. "Tell Susan I sent you," Tommy said. "She's the head nurse, tough as nails but fair. And bring your guitar mate. They'll love it." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of walking and remembering. Ozzy bought a meat pie from a butcher's shop that had been there since his childhood, the pastry flaky and the filling rich with gravy. He sat on a low wall and ate it with his fingers, watching the world go by. A group of teenagers passed, their headphones blasting music he didn't recognize, and he wondered if any of them dreamed the way he had dreamed, if any of them would one day stand on a stage and scream into the void. When the sun began to dip, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he returned to the bed and breakfast, showered, and changed into a clean shirt. He tuned the guitar by ear, the way he had learned as a boy, plucking strings until they sang true. Mrs. Patel knocked on his door with a sandwich and a pot of tea, her eyes kind. "You look like a man on a mission," she said. Ozzy smiled and thanked her, but he didn't explain. Some things were better left unsaid. That night, he lay awake again, the guitar case open on the floor like a promise. He thought about the nursing home, about the old folks who played his records, about the way music had carried him out of Aston and across the world only to bring him back again. He thought about his father, who had died before Black Sabbath's first album was released, who had never seen his son become a household name. He thought about the circle of life, how everything came back to the beginning if you lived long enough. And he thought about tomorrow, about walking into St. Mary's with nothing but a guitar and a voice that had survived decades of screaming and excess. He didn't know what he would find there, didn't know if anyone would recognize him or care. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he was going, and he was going alone. Outside, the rain began to fall soft and steady, the kind of rain that soaked into the bones of the city and kept its secrets. Ozzy listened to it drum on the roof and felt a strange peace settle over him. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. He was returning, and in the returning, he would find something he had lost along the way, something small and fragile and infinitely precious. He closed his eyes and let the rain sing him to sleep, the guitar waiting patiently by his side, ready to tell the story he hadn't known he needed to hear. The morning mist hung low over Aston as Ozzy Osbourne slipped out of the bed and breakfast before Mrs. Patel could press a second cup of tea into his hands. He carried the guitar case like a schoolboy, with a secret the strap cutting a familiar groove into his shoulder. No car this time. He wanted the walk, the slow burn of pavement under his boots, the chance to let the neighborhood seep back into his blood. St. Mary's lay 2 miles east past the railway arches where freight trains still rumbled like distant thunder, and past the boarded-up cinema that had once screened Hammer horrors on Saturday nights. He kept to the shadows of the terraced houses, nodding at early dog walkers who squinted but didn't place the hooded figure. The air tasted of wet brick and diesel, and every breath reminded him that this was the flavor of home. At the wrought iron gates of St. Mary's, a faded sign read, "Visitors Welcome Ring Bell." Ozzy pressed the buzzer twice, then stepped back as a crackling voice answered, "Yes?" He cleared his throat. "Delivery for Susan," he said, pitching his voice higher than usual, a trick learned from decades of disguising himself from paparazzi. The gate clicked open. Inside the grounds were surprisingly green-clipped lawns, rose beds fighting valiantly against the damp, a wooden bench beneath a horse chestnut tree, shedding its last spiky husks. A woman in navy scrubs strode toward him, clipboard in hand, eyebrows arched in professional skepticism. Susan, he guessed, mid-40s, brisk, the kind of nurse who could lift a patient, and a budget deficit with equal efficiency. "Delivery?" she asked, scanning him head to toe. Ozzy lowered the hood. Recognition flickered, then widened into something close to alarm. "Mr. Osbourne," her voice dropped to a whisper, as if saying the name too loudly might summon security. Ozzy lifted a finger to his lips. "Just Ozzy. And I'm not here, officially. Tommy sent me." Susan's face softened at the mention of the taxi driver. Everyone in Aston knew Tommy. She glanced at the guitar case. "You planning to play?" Ozzy shrugged. "If they'll have me. No cameras, no fuss. Just a few songs for the residents." Susan hesitated, then nodded toward the main building. "Common rooms through the double doors. Tea's at 10, but they're already gathering. Mind the carpet newly steamed. Inside the corridor smelled of lavender polish and toast. Framed photographs lined the walls, sepia images of the building as a convent nuns in starched wimples. Later shots of residents in paper hats at Christmas parties. Ozzy's boots squeaked on the linoleum. A trolley rattled past, pushed by a teenage volunteer whose headphones leaked tinny pop. Susan led him into a spacious room with high windows and rows of mismatched armchairs. 24 residents were already seated, some in wheelchairs, some perched on the edges of seats, as if ready to bolt. A record player in the corner spun an old Vera Lynn 78 at half speed. Conversation hushed when Ozzy entered. Eyes tracked him like searchlights. Susan clapped once. "Everyone, we have a special volunteer today. He's brought his guitar and would like to share a tune or two." A ripple of curiosity. Ozzy set the case on a low table, clicked the latches, and lifted out the acoustic, a Martin he had bought in Nashville after a particularly brutal tour, its spruce top scarred from 1,000 pick attacks. He tuned quickly, the pegs familiar under his fingers. "Morning," he said, voice gravelly but warm. "I'm Ozzy. Grew up 5 streets from here. Thought I'd drop by and say hello." A white-haired woman in the front row leaned forward. "You any relation to the lad who bit the head off a bat?" Laughter erupted, thin but genuine. Ozzy grinned. "Same bloke. Though the bat was rubber and I was off me head." He strummed the opening chords of Crazy Train, but slowed the tempo to a loping acoustic sway. The riff transformed into something almost tender. Heads began to nod. A man with a walking frame tapped the floor in perfect time. Ozzy let the first verse breathe, then invited them to join the chorus. Voices rose, cracked, wavering but defiant. When he shifted into, "Mama, I'm coming home," the room stilled. A woman in a knitted cardigan pressed a tissue to her eyes. Another clutched a photograph of a young man in RAF uniform. Ozzy sang the line about carrying the weight of the world, and for a moment, the weight felt shared, distributed across every shoulder in the room. Between songs, he moved among them, kneeling to hear stories. Mrs. Jenkins, 92, told him how her husband had worked the night shift at the same factory where Ozzy once tested car horns. She still had the brass badge he wore. Mr. Patel, unrelated to the landlady, recalled sneaking into the Crown Pub underage to watch Polka Tulk Ozzy's pre-Sabbath band. "You played early one morning on a busted amp," he said. "Sounded like a dying cat, but we loved it." Ozzy laughed until his ribs hurt. Susan circulated with cups of tea, her earlier wariness replaced by something like pride. A teenage care assistant filmed discreetly on her phone, then thought better and slipped it away. Halfway through changes, Ozzy noticed a lone figure at the garden door. The man sat in a wheelchair blanket over his knees, staring not at the singer, but at something beyond the glass. His hands rested on a small wooden box on his lap. Ozzy finished the song, accepted a slice of Victoria sponge from a trembling plate, then excused himself. Susan caught his sleeve. "That's Albert," she murmured. "Doesn't speak much. Keeps to himself. But he asked for your records yesterday, said he had something to show you." Ozzy's curiosity sharpened. He crossed the room, pushed open the door, and stepped into the cool morning air. The garden was quieter, the chatter muffled behind glass. Albert's wheelchair faced a rose bed where late blooms struggled against the frost. Ozzy pulled a plastic chair alongside. "All right, mate." Albert turned slowly. His eyes were pale blue, sharp, despite the years. He studied Ozzy for a long moment, then opened the wooden box. Inside lay a faded photograph and a tarnished silver bracelet. The photo showed two young men in miners' helmets, arms slung around each other, faces streaked with coal dust. Behind them, a child of perhaps 5 grinned gap-toothed at the camera. Ozzy's breath caught. The child was him. The men were his father. Jack and Albert lifted the bracelet, turning it so the inscription caught the light, "Brothers in Dust." Ozzy had seen that phrase once before, carved into the lid of his mother's jewelry box, but he had never known its origin. Albert's voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "Your dad gave me this the night the roof came down. Said if we made it out, we'd never forget." He placed the bracelet in Ozzy's palm. The metal was warm from Albert's skin. Ozzy closed his fingers around it, feeling the weight of decades. Behind them, the common room windows reflected the scene like a silent film, residents pressed to the glass, Susan's hand over her mouth. Ozzy realized the morning's performance had only been the overture. The real song was just beginning. Albert's fingers trembled only slightly as he closed the wooden box, the click of the latch echoing like a starting pistol in the quiet garden. Ozzy sat frozen, the silver bracelet heavy in his palm, its engraved letters, "Brothers in Dust," pressing into his skin as if branding him with a truth he had never been told. The roses around them swayed in a sudden breeze, releasing a faint perfume that mixed with the damp earth and distant kitchen smells drifting from the open windows of St. Mary's. Behind the glass, the residents had formed a silent semicircle, their faces pressed close enough to fog the panes, but no one dared interrupt. Susan stood at the door, arms folded, guarding the moment like a sentinel. Ozzy found his voice first low and rough. "Tell me the night," he said. Not a question, a command wrapped in pleading. Albert leaned back in the wheelchair, the blanket slipping to reveal faded tattoos. Anchors, Roses, a tiny pickaxe, inked on his wrist from a time when miners marked their skin the way sailors did. He began to speak, and the garden itself seemed to lean in. The story unfolded in layers, each one peeling back a different year, a different fear. Albert described the Aston colliery in its final decade, when the seams were thinning and the National Coal Board was squeezing every ounce of profit before closure. Jack Osbourne, Ozzy's father, and Albert had started on the same shift, two lads from the same street who discovered they shared a birthday month and a hatred for the foreman's whistle. They worked the coal face together, crouched in tunnels no taller than a man's waist, lamps flickering on their helmets like fireflies in hell. The pay was poor, the air thick with dust that turned lungs black, but the camaraderie was fierce. They invented games to survive the boredom, guessing the next wagon's weight carving initials into timber props, singing hymns in rounds to drown out the endless clatter of the conveyor belt. Then came the night the roof decided it had held long enough. Albert remembered the exact sound, a low groan like a giant waking from sleep, followed by the sharp crack of timber snapping. The lights went first, plunging them into absolute dark. Dust billowed so thick it choked the throat and blinded the eyes. Men screamed a sound Albert said he still heard in lifts and tunnels to this day. Jack was directly beneath the fall when the first slab dropped. Albert, 2 yards behind, saw the shadow descend and moved without thinking. He threw himself forward, shoulder first, taking the impact meant for his friend. The weight crushed him against the coal seam ribs, cracking like dry twigs, but it bought Jack the seconds he needed to scramble clear. In the pitch black, Albert felt around for Jack's hand, found it slick with blood and sweat, and began to drag him back toward the main roadway. The bracelet, Jack's own, bought with overtime wages as a 21st birthday gift to himself, snagged on a jagged rock and tore free. Jack pressed it into Albert's palm as they crawled. "If we get out," he gasped, "this says we're brothers, dust and all." They made it to the rescue cage just as the second fall sealed the tunnel behind them. 12 men were pulled out that night. 3 did not come up at all. Albert lost the tip of his left little finger to gangrene. Weeks later, a small price beside the lives saved. Ozzy listened without moving the bracelet, now clenched so tight the edges cut half moons into his skin. When Albert reached the part about the hospital, how Jack visited every day with cigarettes smuggled past the nuns, how they laughed about starting a band called the Dust Lads, Ozzy felt the first tear slip free. He didn't wipe it away. Albert noticed, reached over, and patted Ozzy's knee with the same hand that had pulled a grown man through hell. "Your dad never forgot," Albert said. "Every Christmas he'd send a card. When you lot started making noise, pardon the pun, he clipped every review, stuck 'em in a scrapbook. Said his boy was singing the pain out of the mines for the whole world." The garden gate creaked then, and Susan appeared carrying 2 mugs of tea, strong enough to stand a spoon in. She set them on the small table between the men, then retreated without a word, pulling the residents back inside with gentle murmurs. Privacy at last. Ozzy sipped the tea, scalding and sweet, and found the courage to ask the question that burned hottest. "Why didn't he ever tell me your name?" Albert smiled, the expression folding a lifetime of lines into something soft. "Jack wanted you to fly, not look back. Said if you knew how close we came, you'd feel owed. But debts like that don't work on paper, son. They work in here." He tapped his chest over the heart. Ozzy opened the wooden box again and lifted the photograph. The child version of himself stared back, cheeks smeared with jam, standing between the 2 miners like a mascot. On the back, in fading biro, Jack had written, "To Albert, my brother in dust, my son's guardian angel. Keep him safe when I can't." Ozzy traced the words with a trembling finger. He thought of every time he had raged on stage, every lyric about paranoia, and war pigs and iron men, and realized they were all echoes of this single night of men trapped underground, fighting for one more breath, one more dawn. He asked to see the scar. Albert hesitated, then rolled up his sleeve. A jagged line ran from elbow to wrist, pale against the weathered skin, the missing finger a blunt reminder. Ozzy touched it gently, reverently, the way he once touched the fretboard before the first note of Paranoid. "Does it still hurt?" he whispered. Albert shook his head. "Only when I forget to be grateful." They sat in silence, then the kind that doesn't need filling. A blackbird landed on the path, cocked its head, and trilled a three-note riff that sounded suspiciously like the opening of Iron Man. Ozzy laughed through fresh tears. Albert joined in, the sound rusty but real. When the laughter faded, Ozzy made a promise not grand, not for cameras, but spoken straight into the space between two men who finally understood the shape of the same debt. "I'm going to fix this place," he said, gesturing at the peeling paint on the garden walls, the cracked greenhouse where tomatoes refused to ripen. "St. Mary's stays open. And you're not spending another winter wondering if the roof will hold." Albert started to protest, but Ozzy cut him off. "Dad would haunt me if I didn't. And trust me, I know haunting." Susan returned as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the lawn. She carried a small portable speaker and a stack of blank CDs. "The residents want copies of this morning's songs," she explained, "and they want to hear the story." Ozzy looked at Albert, who nodded once. Together, they wheeled back inside the bracelet now on Ozzy's wrist, where it caught the light like a secret signal. The common room had transformed. Chairs formed a circle. Fairy lights someone had found in a cupboard twinkled overhead, and a banner, hand-painted on butcher paper, read, "Welcome home, Prince." Ozzy took the center, Albert beside him, and began to speak not as the rock star, but as John Michael Osbourne, son of Jack Keeper, of a story no headline had ever touched. He told them about the tunnel, the dust, the bracelet. He told them how music had started as a scream in the dark and become a ladder out. Residents wept openly. Susan passed tissues like communion wafers. When words ran out, Ozzy picked up the guitar. He didn't play a Sabbath song. Instead, he played a melody he had never written down, something slow and minor that tasted of coal seams and hospital corridors. Albert hummed harmony, his voice surprisingly steady. The residents joined on the chorus, inventing words about brothers and dust and never forgetting. Someone started clapping on the offbeat. Another tapped a walking stick like a drum. The room became a living thing, breathing in unison. At the end, Ozzy knelt before Albert and fastened the bracelet around the older man's wrist, right over the scar, completing the circle. "It was always yours," he said. Albert's eyes shone, "and now it's both of ours." Outside, the clouds parted just enough for a shaft of sunlight to strike the rose bed, turning every droplet into a tiny prism. Ozzy felt the weight lift, not gone, but shared. He understood now that the greatest riffs weren't born in studios or stadiums. They were forged in moments like this, when one man's hand reached through the dark and pulled another into the light. Susan locked the garden door behind them, promising to keep the press away until Ozzy was ready. But ready was a moving target. As he and Albert sat beneath the horse-chestnut tree, planning the impossible concerts, Grant's, a foundation named Brothers in Dust, Ozzy realized the story wasn't ending. It was only just finding its chorus. And for the first time in decades, the Prince of Darkness felt unmistakably, unshakably alive. The days following the garden revelation blurred into a whirlwind of purpose for Ozzy Osbourne, the kind of focused frenzy he had once reserved for recording deadlines or tour itineraries. He transformed the modest bed and breakfast room into a command center laptop, open on the rickety desk phone pressed to his ear, scribbled notes on Mrs. Patel's complimentary stationery. First call went to his longtime solicitor in London, a man accustomed to bailing Ozzy out of scandals, but now tasked with salvation. Set up a trust, Ozzy instructed. Name it Aston Miner's Legacy. Pour in enough to keep St. Mary's running for a decade, then fund scholarships for kids whose parents still graft in what's left of heavy industry. The solicitor protested the scale. Ozzy cut him off. I've spent more on one bloody music video. Make it happen. Next, he rallied the old guard. Geezer Butler answered on the second ring voice, thick with sleep despite the afternoon hour. You in trouble again, the bassist grumbled. Ozzy laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in years. Opposite, mate. Need you and Tony for a one-off Aston Square benefit gig. Bring the riffs. Tony Iommi, ever the pragmatist, asked about permits and production. Ozzy waved it off. Local council owes me after that time I played the NEC without permits in '82. They'll bend. Word spread through the Sabbath network like wildfire through dry grass. Roadies who had retired to caravan parks dusted off flight cases. Sound engineers booked trains from Manchester. Even Bill Ward sent a text, "Can't drumbacks shot, but I'll bang a tambourine for Albert." Back at St. Mary's, Ozzy became a daily fixture. He arrived each morning with pastries from the High Street Bakery, sat with Albert in the Sun Lounge, and pored over yellowed maps of the old colliery system. Albert marked the exact spot of the collapse with a trembling finger, recounting how the rescue team had tunneled sideways for 6 hours to reach them. Ozzy recorded the stories on his phone, not for posterity, but for the setlist snippets to weave between songs, turning personal history into communal anthem. Susan coordinated logistics, portable ramps for wheelchairs, extra nurses on shift a marquee in case of rain. Residents formed a planning committee. Mrs. Jenkins designed posters on the home's ancient computer. Mr. Patel sourced vintage Sabbath vinyl for raffle prizes. The concert took shape with astonishing speed. Aston Square, once a market, now a concrete expanse flanked by charity shops, and a Greg's was closed to traffic for the first time since the Queen's Silver Jubilee. Local businesses donated the butcher-supplied pies, the off-license crates of ale, the florist garlands of black and purple ribbons. Ozzy insisted on a stage built from reclaimed pit props, salvaged from a demolished winding house, each beam scarred and authentic. He rehearsed in the St. Mary's Common Room acoustic versions that evolved nightly as residents suggested tweaks. Slow the intro to Iron Man, Albert advised. Let the silence speak first, like the moment before the roof fell. The night arrived crisp and clear, the sky a deep indigo bowl above the floodlights. By 6 o'clock, the square filled families who had never afforded arena tickets, old miners in flat caps, teenagers in homemade Sabbath shirts. Portable heaters glowed orange. The smell of onions and vinegar drifted from food stalls. Ozzy watched from the wings bracelet glinting on his wrist, heart hammering harder than any stadium adrenaline rush. Susan wheeled Albert to a reserved spot, front and center. A black Sabbath hoodie draped over his shoulders, despite his protests. Geezer and Tony tuned up backstage trading jokes about arthritis and hearing aids. When the house lights dimmed, a single spotlight hit the pit prop stage. Ozzy stepped out alone first, acoustics slung low. "This isn't about me," he said into the mic, voice steady. "It's about the men who went underground so we could see daylight. About the women who kept hearths burning. About a mate who saved my dad's life and never asked for a bloody thing. He launched into a stripped planet caravan, the melody floating like smoke over the crowd. Phones rose, but not for selfies, for recording grandparents swaying in wheelchairs. Then Geezer and Tony joined the riff of Paranoid Reborn as a mid-tempo stomp that had pensioners clapping on the offbeat. Between songs, Ozzy narrated the collapse, the bracelet, the letters Jack never mailed, but Albert kept anyway. Each story landed like a power chord, resonant and undeniable. Mid-set, Ozzy beckoned Albert on stage. The old miner hesitated, but Susan and two orderlies guided the wheelchair up the ramp. Ozzy knelt mic in hand. This man lost a finger pulling my father from the dark. Tonight, he gets the loudest cheer Aston's ever given. The crowd roared a wave of sound that rattled windows 3 streets away. Albert, cheeks flushed, lifted the bracelet in salute. Ozzy, strapped on the Les Paul, counted in no more tears. The song, once a lament for personal demons, became a hymn of gratitude, every lyric reframed by the man beside him. When the solo hit, pyrotechnics were forbidden. Instead, the stage lights strobed in sync with the heartbeat of the square. After the final chord, Ozzy announced the Trust's first acts. St. Mary's saved a new wing, named after Albert scholarships for 20 local kids starting next term. He introduced the Rock Roots initiative. Every artist on his label roster required to play one hometown benefit per tour, no exceptions. Cameras from the local news captured residents hugging band members, children clutching signed drumsticks. As the crowd thinned, Ozzy found Albert back in the sun lounge, the hoodie folded neatly on his lap. "You didn't have to do all this," the old man said. Ozzy shook his head. "Had to. You taught me the circle closes when you pass the torch, not when you hoard the flame." Months later, the changes solidified. St. Mary's bustled with renovations, wider doorways, a music therapy room stocked with guitars, a garden mural of the colliery painted by residents. Scholarship recipients, gritty teens from council estates, visited weekly learning riffs from Ozzy via video link. Albert moved into a ground-floor suite with a window overlooking the roses. The wooden box now sat on a shelf beside framed photos of the concert. Ozzy returned often, no longer a visitor, but family, bringing Sharon and the kids to meet the man who had unknowingly shaped their legacy. The lesson crystallized in quiet moments. Gratitude is not a feeling, it is architecture. Build with it stages from pit props, futures from forgotten stories, communities from shared scars, and the structure endures. Music had always been Ozzy's escape. Now it was his bridge spanning the chasm between the boy who fled Aston and the man who returned to fortify it. Every time a new scholar strummed their first power chord or a resident sang War Pigs in the shower, the circle tightened unbreakable. And on the wrist of the Prince of Darkness gleamed a simple silver band, etched with words that needed no amplification, brothers in dust, forever.